Hello, I'm Jeff James, the Editorial Director of the Petri IT Knowledge Base. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our free webinar, Active Directory Auditing Headaches and How to Solve Them, sponsored by Netwrix. I'd like to first start by introducing our speakers. Petri IT Knowledge Base Contributing Editor John O'Neill Sr. and Netwrix Vice President of Marketing Nick Cavalancia. John O'Neill Sr., during his 20-plus years in the IT industry, John has enjoyed the opportunity to work as a consultant, architect, executive speaker, and author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects, as well as finding solutions for small businesses, allowing them to use technology to increase business opportunity and decrease operational complexity. And he's genuinely a good guy on top of that. As for Nick Cavalancia is VP of Marketing with Netrix, where he assists in driving innovation and the evangelism of Netrix solutions. He has over 20 years of enterprise AT experience and is an accomplished consultant, trainer, speaker, columnist, and patent holder. He has authored, co-authored, and contributed to over a dozen books on Windows, Active Directory, Exchange, and other Microsoft technologies. So with that, I would like to turn things over to John and Nick. And just as a quick reminder, we will have a text-based Q&A session after the presentation where both John and Nick will answer your questions about Active Directory auditing.
How come I'm not a nice guy, Jeff? I don't get to be a nice guy either?
You're a nice guy too, Nick, sir. I didn't want to exclude you.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone. This is John O'Neill Sr. and my fellow great guy, Nick Cavalancia. And
welcome, everyone.
Before we get started, we'd like to take a quick poll that we're going to throw up to try and understand what everybody is going through. Why are you here, and what do you want to listen to about your AD headaches? So we're going to talk about or ask you some questions about what is your biggest AD auditing headache? Is it tracking security changes or meeting compliance requirements? Is it knowing when changes are made or keeping track of historical changes? What is it that most drives you nuts or keeps you up late? Now, Nick, what do you think the answer is going to be?
I don't know. I hope while the poll's running and everyone's answering those questions, yeah, I guess the question kind of becomes, what aspect of IT is actually the biggest issue? Is it things like what's driving the AD auditing headaches, like, let's say, compliance? Or is it actually the work that the IT pros that are listening today are doing themselves, like when changes are made? And I guess that really becomes part of the question. Is it what's driving it, or is it what they're doing themselves? And my guess is probably more so the knowing when changes are knowing when changes are made. Excuse me, I just made up a word. I don't think changes are going to mate. That'd be kind of strange. But tracking security change. They said they're mating. I don't know why they came out. It just did. It is what it is. But tracking security changes, I think those two, in my mind, are the biggest ones because they're more close to home for the IT pro than something like a compliance record or even historical changes. I mean, I don't know if, John, you got a different opinion or where you come from in this one.
Well, I definitely feel that there's going to be a lot that are faced with meeting some sort of compliance requirement, right, where they have to prove things if they're a publicly held company, or even if they're private, they're going back and proving why somebody has access to a certain business system or whatever. And they're IT people. They have lots of things to do and little time to do it in, so they want to meet this compliance overhead as quickly and as pain-free as possible.
Interesting. So I'm focused on the work in the trenches, and you're more focused on maybe the reasons what's driving them in the first place. I don't know if maybe we'd get enough time while we take a look at the results and let's just see what comes up.
Sounds good.
Ooh, I win. So 58% of you said tracking security changes. Only 32%, John, said meeting compliance requirements. And
well, I can't see the results on my screen, so.
No, you can't? Oh, I can. Then I'll keep reading them. 65% said knowing when changes are made, and 42% is keeping track of historical changes. So you've got a number of people selecting more than one option as really a pain point, but the biggest two were knowing when changes are made and tracking those changes. So we had a second one, didn't we, John? Second poll we put up there?
Yes, we do. Our second poll that Jeff is going to fire up here for us gets into what are you doing to audit your AD today. So now, thinking about the answers you gave to the biggest AD auditing headache, what is it that you're doing to address that besides taking Tylenol or Advil? And no, that wasn't a gratuitous plug. But so let's. Hey, I left your mate comment alone.
Yeah, I didn't.
So when we're talking about what we're doing, are we getting into event log management or SIEM? Are we just kind of sitting back, crossing our fingers, and hoping it's in the event logs, meaning AKA we're doing nothing? Are we doing manual change logging or tracking? Or do we have a change auditing solution in place, like what the folks over at Netwrix have? So what do you think it's going to be this time, Nick, since you pulled it out of the hat last time?
I'll probably get this one wrong, but interestingly enough, we're doing a survey externally asking people what are they doing for kind of change auditing and change management in a very agnostic way, and surprisingly, there's a lot of manual change tracking that's going on. People are definitely saying we're aware of the changes, we're trying to keep track of them all. I think there's a point at which it gets a little overwhelming, but I'm actually kind of going for, I'm going to call it option C here, although there's no letters. The third one, I think that's what people are going to mostly say. But you know, I'm thinking that there's somewhere in the first two as well are going to have kind of, they'll be tied for second is my guess.
This time we are standing side by side. I definitely think that it's going to be the manual change logging and tracking. I think there's a lot of frustrated IT folks with Post-it notes and legal pads and, you know, Word documents or anything else where they're noting the kind of changes that they're making to their systems and hoping that they can pull that data up later. So with that, let's close it out and see what we've got.
We're both wrong. Well, they are using event logs.
I can't
so
see it.
35%. Right, you can't. So 35% are using event log management or SIEM. So that's actually the #1 answer.
Wow.
Followed by 32% of doing nothing. That is, I hope it's in the event logs. You know, we'll have to find out when I get audited. 22% said manual change logging and tracking, and 11% are using a change auditing solution. So we had it wrong slightly in that we're thinking more manual change logging. I'm actually glad to hear that our audience is a third of them only, but a third of them are using event log management or SIEM solution or something that's actually looking at the data, which is a good place to start. So
this is definitely one case where I'm happy to be wrong, right? Because it does mean that people are doing a little bit more.
That'd be good. I'm glad to hear that as well.
Okay, so with that we have an idea of where everybody stands, let's jump right in and start talking about why we audit, right? Because before we answer a question, we have to kind of understand why we're going to answer it. And I'm going to talk about a number of areas where why we should be auditing, starting with security and compliance. And now I'm going to address these in more detail in the coming slides, so I won't talk about them much here, but those are probably the top 2 reasons why we need to audit. And then in addition to that, we also have drivers such as documentation needs, change management, of course, and understanding. And I bring understanding in here because I love the maxim, you can't manage what you can't measure. You can't gain control of the changes to your Active Directory and what's going on with your Active Directory if you can't measure those things. And so we're going to kind of keep that as an underlying theme as we go forward in the presentation. So let's jump right in and talk about security as a driver for AD auditing, right? Well, AD is the front line when it comes to authentication, authorization, and accounting, or AAA, for many organizations, right? And of course, authentication is identifying an object or a user, making sure they are who they say they are. Authorization is granting them specific access to something. And then accounting is, of course, keeping track of what they do with that authorization. And so that's what's commonly known as AAA. And kind of jumping forward from this, I do want to mention that when it comes to security, when you suspect a compromise, the faster your response, the better off you and your systems and your organization will be, right? So if you have any inkling, even if it's just a twinkling in your eye or your nose itching or whatever it is that drives you to think that you have something weird going on your network, respond sooner rather than later.
John, it's interesting you used a AAA kind of a way to remember the front line. I kind of sometimes think of, and I came up with this a couple of years back in one of my previous lives, another sort of AAA, if you will, that I look at as more like a security life cycle. And it's the concept of assess, assign, and audit. And again, I think of it as a security life cycle because think of what happens when we're going through security and figure out where auditing kind of comes in play there. The first thing you would do is assess the current state of security. And you figure out by looking into seeing whether you're looking at logs or looking at just a snapshot of what is in place today. And you maybe see some things that need to be modified, so that's where the assign comes in, and you make some additions, some deletions, maybe some modifications. And then the last one, of course, being audit, and audit is, in the case of the life cycle, was intended when I wrote it, was more about auditing the usage of the security that's in play. But what's interesting as we kind of take all this and apply it to auditing and auditing headaches, auditing actually plays a role in all three of those parts, just in different ways. In the assessment, auditing is more about assessing the current state of security as well as what does the previous security looked like. For example, if someone was added into the domain admins group and then taken out, as just that's one scenario. So looking at just the current state isn't necessarily telling you historically what it looked like, but you're doing an assessment, and then when you're doing an assignment, someone's making changes, and you want to audit those changes and know what changes are being made in order to better secure and lock down your environment. And then, of course, the auditing part is really just, again, about auditing the access, and that's a different kind of auditing. But in each case, auditing is a little different. One being about the current state of security, one being about the changes actively being made, and the third one being about the usage of that security on the resource or resources in question. So I just brought that. I thought I'd bring that up a little bit because that's just another way to kind of look at AD security in more of a life cycle format.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the importance or breadth of AD auditing and its complexity that we have two very good AAA acronyms that literally just target this single problem or single situation, if you will. So that's great information. And moving past that, now let's kind of evolve that and talk about compliance, because compliance is, in some ways, it is a component of security, right? Our external audits, our compliance with laws such as high-tech or Sarbanes-Oxley, boy, I hacked that up. Anyways, that's a component of how secure our organization is, and how our organization says, hey, our financial records or our systems are this secure because we comply with these things. And when it comes down to it, compliance is just answering those age-old questions of who, what, when, where, and why. But in terms of our event today and what we're talking about, we're really talking about the 5 W's when it comes to AD, or our Active Directory. And before people start tuning out and going, well, that only really affects public companies that have to comply with laws, or not-for-profit or government or those kind of things. No. It is necessary for both public and private organizations, right? And this can come from two different aspects. Private organizations also have external audits where they're guaranteeing the integrity of their financial data and those kind of things, so they do have compliance requirements. You also have compliance requirements being driven by external vendors, external stakeholders, customers, that kind of thing. So you may be a very small private organization, but you're doing business with the automotive industry, for instance, and they demand that, hey, you provide data on X, Y, and Z. Well, of course you want to be able to do that because you don't want to lose your customer. That would be kind of self-defeating. And that just rolls right into understanding what your requirements are. don't forget to look at requirements from external stakeholders, like I mentioned, or internal stakeholders, your audit compliance, that kind of stuff.
You know, we even have a customer where they have to actually be compliant because of one of the, you mentioned vendors, and that's actually a really good example. They're a vendor to someone else, to a distributor of some kind, and that company, it needs to be ISO compliant, so they're actually pushing compliance standards down onto this vendor of theirs, saying, if you want to do business with us, you're going to have to meet these compliance requirements. And so I think you're absolutely spot on saying it's not just we're a publicly traded company or we're a financial industry company or something like that. It can apply to just about everybody. But even beyond that, sometimes compliance is even just about complying with a standard of change management or something like that. I always look at security as being about access, and compliance is about behavior. And that is, are people acting in a way that is appropriate with the standards we put in place? That's what compliance is really about. And it's interesting because on your initial slide when you said some of the reasons to audit, you clued in on the documentation. And I just recently wrote an article when I was talking about, can security and compliance kind of coexist, or really do they coexist? And the reason is, usually when the IT pros that are here in the audience today are making changes to Active Directory, you know, they might be making, it could be anything from a low-level schema change of some kind all the way up to just, you know, changing someone's password. They're more focused about just making the change and moving on. You know, that's just the access that needs to be taken care of. But then when the auditor comes in play, the challenge becomes the auditor is going to ask questions that the IT person never, ever thought of. One of the questions that our pro-serve guys have actually heard from customers is an auditor asking, can you tell me who's been in the domain admins group for the last 12 months? Now, I would tell our audience, think about that. If you were asked, who was in the domain admins group on March 13th? I have no idea. You know, but they're being asked that kind of a question because compliance is about behavior, and they want to figure out who do they have to look at to see if their behaviors are right. And then beyond that, then that kind of question begets another question, which is, of all those people that were in there, now what did those people do? Because now we're trying to figure out what the behavior of those individuals was, and what did they do, and therefore to figure out if what they did was compliant with whatever the standards are that we're trying to adhere to. And so the documentation, kind of coming around full circle, is what ties these two things together. If you have the documentation that shows, let's say, who was in the domain admins group, as the case might be, and what actions they took in Active Directory while they were in that group, now you have a full breadth of ability to answer the compliance requirements of a given auditor coming in and asking all these, you know, strange questions you've never conceived of anyone ever asking in their right mind.
Absolutely, and I mean, really, as far as I'm concerned, you start thinking about that, and it can really kind of make you pucker, right? That you can start being asked pretty much anything that isn't even relevant to your design or architecture, because it could be coming from an outside source. You know, I can imagine a, you know, kind of a long night because, you know, the CEO of a medium-sized company comes in and says, hey, you know, we have a $4 million a year customer that is insisting that we be PCI compliant because, you know, the transactions we're doing involve credit cards and those kind of things, and so they want us to prove that. Well, it's not something we've really put in place or we've really planned for, so now we have to struggle because at the end of the day, we have to meet our customers' demands or they'll go elsewhere, you know, and along with that, you could get into, of course, the medical industry where you've got to deal with HIPAA compliance, so now you are some, you know, downstream provider of electronic resources to the medical industry, say a doctor's office. Well, you still could be on the hook to be compliant with, you know, electronic medical records and those kind of things, and that all bleeds into AD auditing. It's not just those systems because you're using AD as a glue to hold them all together.
Agreed.
So now that we've kind of, you know, done the terror spiel here, we'll jump into just the I guess we could call this our 5 stages, right? The 5 stages of grief or whatever they talk about, and this is the one where we just you know, come to grips with it.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. We are going to be asked for something. Like you mentioned, somebody's going to come in and say, hey, who was in the domain admins group on March 22nd? Or, you know, who had access to the financial systems in this network share on January 1st? Whatever it is, it's going to happen. Somebody's going to bring a request, and we're going to have to go back and find information that was in our ID. And now, what do we do at that point? Do we, you know, panic and basically call all hands in to start sifting through our event logs on every one of our servers, possibly some, you know, saved event logs? Maybe we've got some of that going on, whatever. But at the end of the day, of course, that's not really a viable option. We can't tell the auditors no. That one really doesn't work. And even if I kind of step back from that and say, fine, we give them a great answer and say, yeah, we're going to stop everything and go through it, does the data even exist? So what's our answer when we can't find it? When, you know, we're looking for this needle in a stack of needles. It's not even a needle in a haystack. It's a needle in a stack of needles. And then we realize that the needle we're looking for isn't even in there after we've invested, you know, hundreds of man-hours trying to find it. What does that boil down to for an organization other than, you know, bad results?
Yeah, we talked about security and compliance being some of the drivers. I think the other thing here is just it could even be IT changes impact availability or performance of services. And I'll give you a real-world example from one of our customers. We had a customer that their issue was, and they were already a customer of ours, so this is actually, you know, sort of like I get to tout my own solution, but that's not really the point. They had suddenly this Exchange server go down. So those of you on the audience that have ever worked with Exchange, you're of course going to go, let me, you know, do a basic ping test. That works. Okay, can the thing do an NS lookup? Yeah. Okay, the DNS is working. Yeah, and you're trying everything, seeing that, making sure the network cards aren't disabled, the cables aren't plugged, services aren't down. You're looking furiously, trying to figure out what it is that's keeping this Exchange server from running. Well, what ended up happening was there was a change made to inside sites and services where a guy changed one of the Active Directory site subnet masks, and because of the way that he made the subnet mask, it ended up isolating the Exchange server on its own logical Active Directory site with no DC in that site. And so, of course, Active Directory needs to go to a DC in order to do, you know, LDAP queries and figure out, you know, where it's sending something to. And so basically the Exchange server stopped functioning, not because Exchange had a problem, but because it didn't have a DC. Now, for the audience, think about that. How long would it take you until you're going to actually figure out, let's check sites and services and see if somebody changed the subnet mask? It's not going to
I don't
happen.
know that I'd ever come to that, right? I mean, I'd have to be like just kind of pulling straws out of it.
Yeah, that's like a phone call to Microsoft at that point. And yet, you know, knowing that there are changes, you know, happening is kind of, I think, the point of what your slide here is saying. It's going to have, something is going to happen. This isn't FUD. You know, maybe you're going to go, we'll have to worry about compliance. It doesn't apply to us. Okay. Security, trying to make sure your environment is secure. You might want to test that out. And then there are going to be other issues that come into play. So there's somewhere in here, there's some reality for everybody on this call today.
Yeah, let me throw in a true story, an example from my days in the trenches. It kind of goes right along with this. And so I had a customer, and they had a financial problem, a fraud, right? And basically what it boiled down to is that they had a employee, obviously became an ex-employee, but an employee who got access to the direct deposit transmission file that was created by their payroll system. So their payroll system creates this file, and then another application would transmit it to the bank. So that file contains transactions, if you will. Take this out of this account and deposit it into this account and that kind of thing. Well, this person gained access to the share where that was, and then took and modified it. They figured out, you know, the coding inside of it, because it's not encrypted, because the bank doesn't support encryption, and they actually added a line that transferred money into another account. And it took hundreds of hours, probably thousands of hours, by the time we found how they gained access, because what happened is another ex-employee gave them access to that share. It was a controller level person, gave them access to that share just for one day. just long enough to make the change. So by the time we noticed the problem and went looking, the person that actually committed the fraud was no longer on the access right list, right? So we had to go back in time and try and spot when all of a sudden they gained access and lost access. And it was very expensive.
I'm shaking my head just thinking zeros have never had more power, have they?
I'm telling you.
I think I'll give myself just a couple zeros just for the decimal, and I'm good.
Yeah, it's like those all the movies, right, where you have the little worm that just eats a penny off every transaction.
As if, man.
So, okay, moving on past that. That was a great discussion. I love it. Let's talk about what are the things we need to be auditing then to address all these concerns and make sure that we have the data when the time comes. Well, first off, of course, we have to deal with security context changes. And this is all the stuff you would think of it as. So password changes, right? When are people resetting their passwords, or when are administrators resetting passwords for other users, that sort of thing. When are people being added or taken out of groups? We just discussed scenarios, right, of going into the domain admins group and being removed from it, or going into the group that had permissions to that share with the financial data and coming out of it. That's a security context change. And finally, pretty much anything that enables, disables, or deletes an object or a right. Because if we're changing the ability of an account or a person to be able to do something in our system, we should have a record of that. And it works both ways. It works both ways. Apparently, I'm going to talk funny now. Where you want to log not just an elevation of privilege, but also a reduction of privilege. You need to know everything that's happening. Along with that, we want to be taking into account what is happening with our computer accounts. Everybody forgets about the computer account because they don't really think of it as something that has rights in AD, but it absolutely does. Computer accounts are authenticated against AD, so we should be tracking, auditing when things are added or removed. By things, I mean computer accounts to our AD. And we also want to be auditing, logging, tracking when computer accounts are shifted between OUs, because remember, OUs can often control group policies and other rights that are being automatically or automagically, if you will, assigned to objects within them. And so someone can change the rights of a computer or a user account or group just by shifting their OU.
It's interesting about this list here, John, that you've got is I think maybe some of the audience might be even thinking of, looking for even more detail than what we're talking about here, but I would almost like to address that before it ever kind of comes up. I think in a lot of cases, IT guys don't have a lot of time on their hands. So I think if John and I were up here telling you that you need to look at event ID, 2768 or 5894, I'm just making up numbers, that's not entirely helpful either, because I think the reality is you're going to have to be able to utilize something that's going to be having done some of the work for you to come up with some of that intelligence to figure out which events to be looking for. And we're going to talk about some of those kinds of solutions in a couple of minutes, including just stuff that's just free to you guys. So, I really appreciate the fact that you're kind of covering this in a more of a broad scope, because there are these basic kinds of security changes that we would never think of as being important. And yet they are. In fact, you talk about the reduction of privileges. That's just something. As IT pros, I remember being in the trenches. I didn't care. I was so focused on the goal of whatever it was I was trying to do. Let me create that group, add that person into it, give them rights to whatever it is, and then I'm done on to the next project. Never really thought of the fact that it should be something that is audited and documented and noted, so that in a later time I could always come back in case a problem arose.
Absolutely, and I used to try and, I used to memorize a few event IDs here and there, and my wife basically smacked me upside the head and said I wasn't allowed to do that anymore because it was displacing some, memory of my kids growing up or something. That got pushed out of my brain in exchange for event ID 9231. And
nice.
So now we just look it up when the time comes.
It's event-ID.net is for, I think, isn't it?
So, the last thing I mentioned was a shift in OUs, and I want to address that a little bit deeper down, a deeper dive, because I think a lot of us forget about OUs. And OU management, I believe, is critical to that concept of, you can't manage what you can't measure. So when you don't have control of your OUs and they get out of hand and you have this OU sprawl where you have dozens or even hundreds of OUs, and I've even seen it where OUs are created and they have 1 or 2 objects in them. That's not probably a great use for an OU, because now things have gotten so out of hand that you can't keep track of where things are and then what is being applied to them. So maybe a group policy was applied to an OU and you don't realize it, and that group policy changes, access rates or the programs that are installed or all sorts of things. So you need to understand what your OUs look like and ultimately have a managed OU structure where you are controlling it. It is not controlling you. That, I believe, is critical to proper Active Directory operation and ultimately being able to audit and understand your Active Directory with as few Excedrin extra strength involved as possible, or trips to the Jim Beam cabinet. Although I've found that productivity starts declining with that one.
Too much personal information, John.
Well, then you're going to love this, because really what I talk to this is my OUs gone wild slide, right?
Oh,
their OUs are on spring break and they're just breaking it loose. So with that, I'll just quietly jump to the next slide before I get in more trouble than I need to be in. So now I want to mention to everyone that even if you don't have anything today, even if you haven't invested in anything, there is help available. You don't have to just rely on Post-it notes and legal pads. There are things that you can be using to make your life simpler and address some of these AD auditing requirements and headaches. First and foremost, we have event logs, right? I mean, that's kind of the repository of all information of what's happening on our computers. And along with that, with Windows 2008 R2, Windows Server 2008 R2, we gained event log subscriptions. And these are great for anybody that is trying to gather and interpret event log data from, a handful of servers, maybe a couple dozen. And I wouldn't get into hundreds or thousands. This doesn't really scale well, but it's definitely something that you should be doing if you have a couple dozen servers or whatnot. Take advantage of event log subscriptions, and there's a URL where you can go learn exactly what it takes to set up and get those going. And then after that, there are a number of AD auditing freeware applications that can really help you report on and understand what's going on in your event logs, because that's one of the problems that you really face is the data may be there in your event log, but you can't print it out or work with it in a fashion that makes it easy to interpret and glean what you need from it, right? It's kind of a little bit of data buried in a whole bunch of other data that you don't care about. So these freeware solutions can do a lot to help you address that and get you closer to the information you need sooner rather than later.
You touched on something that I think when you kind of got glossed over real quick that is important to point out from this slide. For the guys out there listening in the audience, the data is there in the event logs, most of it. There's some stuff that you just can't get from event logs because Microsoft doesn't populate it, but most of your answers are in the event logs. You have a tool. I mean, it's free. It's cumbersome. I mean, I've done it. You can do searches. You do a find. You can find the one event. Sometimes you have to find a couple events and put them together and so on. But the data is there. And the event log subscriptions, if you haven't used that, it's simply a service where you're defining one server that's going to be a repository, a couple other servers that are going to be sending their event log data to this central repository so that you have a centralized single place to go and look at all of your events for a number of servers in one place. And that makes your life at least a little easier when you're doing a find. And I'll stick with 12 of John's suggested number of servers. If you had 12 servers, I don't think anybody on this call wants to go to every server one by one and start scouring through event logs. If you had 12 DCs and going, wonder which server he made the change on or she made the change on. Instead, you're doing it once. Nobody here wants to work for a living, myself included. So we try and make our jobs as easy as possible. And So certainly the event log subscriptions will help. John, why don't we jump to the next slide real quick?
Yeah.
And maybe I can talk a little bit about auditing freeware.
And as we go there, I want to mention that, when I think of event logs, I think of that reality show Hoarders, because it's like you said, the data is there, but it's all
Sorry, I get stacks and stacks of event logs everywhere navigating through your home.
Yeah,
sorry,
absolutely. And you're trying to find, one Coke can from 30 years ago at the bottom of the list. So with that, now we'll talk about why.
IT guys are pickers now. Is that what it is? They're like American pickers, and they're going through trying to find in some guy's old shed the event ID from 3 years ago.
So that's like the new theme. How many reality shows can we mention in a single webinar?
Let's not. So John mentioned some freeware, so I wanted to kind of introduce you to Change Notifier for Active Directory. And if you just kind of click ahead for me, John, a little bit. A couple of things I want to mention here is it used to be called Active Directory Change Reporter Freeware Edition. But what this tool does, it has a couple of feature sets. Go ahead and jump ahead for me. One, it's completely free. And what you're seeing here is that it provides the change detail in kind of a consolidated way, where what this tool has done for you is taken all of, let's say if there's 2 or 3, 4, 10, whatever number of event logs that need to be kind of logically consolidated into one single change that you want to know about, that's already been done for you. So there is a free tool that you can get here where you look at the adds, deletes, the modifications, the objects are changed, so on. And if you look at the screenshot I've got here, just to kind of give you a glimpse of what the product does, you're seeing what kind of change type it was there, kind of in the middle of the screen. You see modified and added there in the middle. If you read across either of those lines, what kind of object was modified. Look to the far right, and you see the actual object name with a path, as well as the details, as long as they're available in the event log. So someone changed the phone number from 1234 to 5678, and you're seeing what was changed. So this is great because it'll actually provide you at least with a basic set of information around what has changed, rather than you having to go scour through event logs. And if you click one more time through, I think I've actually provided a URL to this. Oh, I haven't. That's right. I'm putting it at the end. I forgot about that. It's at the end. I'll have a URL for all you guys listening. If you're interested in that tool, I have a URL at the very end. So let's talk about what's missing from event logs. There's a couple of things. So the first one here that's missing from event logs, if you go ahead and click ahead for me, John, there, is change detail. You have most detail, like some of the basic stuff. Even in the last slide, I showed you a little bit of change detail saying like someone's phone number's changed. But you have things like, let's say, group policy changes. There's no change detail there. As a matter of fact, if you think about when you change a group policy, you're not really modifying the whole policy. You're navigating down through a hierarchy down to some specific policy, changing a bit somewhere from yes to no or 1 to 0 or whatever the case is. And that kind of detail just doesn't exist. So in a lot of cases, you'll have change detail missing even when it comes to Active Directory changes. Second one here is the consolidation of events to a single change. I already mentioned that a little bit in our other free tool, but that's a tough one. Sometimes a single change, if you will, is made up of a number of different events together. Could be someone modifying, let's say, security. The events might be, I read the object, and then I looked at the security, then I modified the security, then I wrote to it. Whatever the case is, you have multiple events, and you want to be able to consolidate that down, because really what you're looking for is, tell me the one thing that Fred did yesterday. I don't want to know the 6 event log entries that make up the one thing. I just want to know who was modifying group memberships yesterday, who was changing security on OUs yesterday. And you may even have even a more specific question than that. So the next one is that there's not an easy way to report on what I like to call criteria-based changes. Like I just sort of mentioned, you're always going to have a very detailed question. You're not going to ask, what happened yesterday? You're asking that question of who modified this OU? Who changed these permissions? Who was added to that group? They're very criteria-based. And event log-based solutions, just when you're looking at logs alone, don't always have the easy way of reporting on those specific criteria. So if you're just going to do like event log subscriptions, you're just consolidating. If you're using just the native event log viewer, you're doing a find. And then the last one I think I have on this slide, if I remember correctly, is insight into what I call state and time of changes. And John and I both have kind of utilized the example that I brought up earlier about who's been in the domain admins group over a period of time. And really, if you're trying to figure out what has changed and you're trying to audit Active Directory, you can't just look at the log data you have. You also have to figure out maybe there's log data you don't have in case you don't have enough archiving or you haven't been going back far enough, or an ability to really kind of put that data together to figure out what something looked like on a given day. John's a great example of somebody having access to a file for, how long was it, John? A day? 2 days?
It was less than 8 hours. It was literally within a shift.
Okay, so within a shift, somebody had access to something. You might miss that. So being able to figure out a state in time and saying, how long did he have access? Maybe you figured out it was Sparky McDuck, that guy, whatever his name is, and Sparky had access for 8 hours. I don't know his name. I don't really care. And so Sparky had access for 8 hours. We want to know, if you knew that Sparky suddenly had access, your next question would be, well, how long did he have access for? And you want to figure that out. And having an ability to look at snapshots of time and figure out how long they had access would actually be critical in your to narrow the scope of what it is you're trying to audit for, what you're trying to search for.
Yeah, because I had on one of my slides a few back that requests aren't always timely. In fact, I would propose that they're very rarely timely. Usually we're being asked about something that we long ago forgot about, right? We didn't even make note of it when it happened, and now we're being asked about it months or even possibly years later. And that's where state and time change reporting becomes so critical.
You're spot on. So let me jump ahead one more slide and just tell you guys about Netrix Auditor a little bit. This is one of the solutions that we have. This is a paid solution, but you see here that it's focused on change and configuration auditing. Does have an application to everything we've talked about today, security, compliance, operations, and that kind of thing. And what it's doing is it's providing detection, and more importantly, what I like to call visibility and intelligence. You've got this data set of event logs, but it's also providing the ability to let you know that something's going on. It's letting you have a visibility into all of those changes. As an example, I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, the fact that we can actually show you group policy changes. And then you also have intelligence there where you're not just seeing, back to that idea of having to consolidate the events. You're not just seeing the individual events and that event ID 4872 happened. You're actually seeing an intelligent combination of those events that are turned into an actual change that someone made, whether it's to Active Directory or some other platforms. And then the last bullet here is you actually have the ability to monitor, audit, and report on these changes. It's not just consolidating event logs. It's actually really monitoring, auditing, and reporting on all those changes to those systems. And then if you look across the bottom here, I'll go ahead and slap up here a listing of 6 different systems that we try and more or less focus on, which is Active Directory, which we're talking about today, Exchange, file servers, VMware, SQL Server, and Windows Server. Jumping down to the next slide here, just a couple things real quickly I'm going to run through because I want to make sure we have some time for questions here at the end. And we've been a little long in the tooth on chatting, me and John here. But you see scheduled on-demand alerting and reporting. There's the change detail that on every single type of a change in Active Directory, including things like group policies, schema, object security, so on. Do have the state and time reporting, so you can go back and see what's there. And then everything down to an attribute level can be recovered through object recovery. And this product does more than just the reanimating of tombstones. This is actually recovering data from Active Directory. And then there's a number of other feature sets that's included in this. You see like password expiration alerting, tracking inactive users, auditing of changes on Windows servers, event log management, and then even doing video recording of user activity on the domain controllers themselves. So let me go ahead and do just a quick demo here of Active Directory Change Reporter. So John, if you go ahead and give me presenter rights, I'll go ahead and just show my screen real quick.
There you go.
Awesome. All right, so you guys should be able to see my screen now. And this is Netwrix Auditor in a console. I'm going to do a very short demo here. I don't want to bore you to tears with 25 minutes of demo, plus we don't have time anyways. And let me just kind of start by telling you how Auditor functions. It does take the event log data, but then in addition to that, with regard to Active Directory, it also takes snapshots. As changes are being made to Active Directory, it takes more and more snapshots of the entire configuration of Active Directory. So what you're able to do with that information, when you tie the two together, if I can tell that based on the event logs, let's say I'm going to stick with group policies because it's something that you really can't get out of event logs natively. But if I know that the event logs say that there's a change to a particular group policy, and I have a snapshot before the change and a snapshot after the change of Active Directory, therefore, in theory, and actually in actuality, we're able to compare those two snapshots and figure out what exactly did change. And this is just a quick set of reports I've got pulled up here. If you look at the left-hand side with me, you'll see a whole set of real-time alerting here, and we've already got predefined types of real-time alerts that you can have set, and this is just email-based alerts. You do have reporting here, and I just got one set focused on here where I can show you some additions, some modifications, even a deletion, and you see the types of details that are here, the object type, who exactly changed it, what was changed, that is the specific object, where was it changed from, like what machine were they on, when was it changed, and then you also see down here things like, in this case, the particular option was added here, passwords never expire, or an email address was set to a certain thing, so a user account was modified. It looks like this guy Harold Brown, Brian Green, and this other guy Vinny, when he was modified, this guy Vinny had his email address modified. So you're seeing all the detail. And then you're also knowing who did it, who made that change, because you see that here in the box, and when and where they made the change from. So there's nothing left to the imagination. You know exactly what was changed, who made it, when they made it, where they made it from. The only thing you're missing kind of is why. You know, why they do it. That's something that's outside the scope of technology, of course. As I kind of scroll down here, I want you to notice the other kinds of groupings that I have: change management with computer accounts, contact objects, domain controllers, groups, and so on. Every kind of change in Active Directory is all able to be reported on within Netwrix Auditor. You do have variables in each of the reports, so you can decide maybe you want to look at a particular user or when a particular time frame, where it was changed from, what forest name, that kind of thing. That's all built into the reporting. The other kind of reporting I really quickly want to show you is just the state and time assessments. And this is done by having multiple snapshots taken. And I just grabbed one here with the administrative groups with their members, and you can see a report here where I can tell, let's say, who's in the domain admins group. We've been kind of talking about that as an example. And you'll see up here at the top, the snapshot date is the current session. But I can add in, I've added in one other previous session, and the idea is I could just simply select that, and it would show me the results if I viewed that report, and hopefully this will come up really quickly here. It would show me what happened in that particular session and what it looked like then. And then there's the ability there for you to actually go ahead and look at those reports and see if there's differences between them. And that way, by having the snapshots and the state and time reporting, your Active Directory is always in what I call a known state. That is, you always know what the configuration of your Active Directory is. So that's kind of I want to kind of leave it at that as far as a demo, because we're going to end up running out of time otherwise. So, John, I'm going to go ahead and kind of give control back to you and make you the presenter so you can go ahead and show your screen.
Great.
And we can just kind of finish off here. So I did that. We're good there. Just real quickly about us, we focus on auditing, been around since 2006, recognized in the Inc. 5000, 2 years running. We also just recently were added into the Deloitte Technology Fast 500. If you jump ahead one slide, you also notice with regard to our customers, everyone's got a big customer slide they always try and impress you with. What I'd like you to pull out of this more than anything is not the logos there or the companies that are represented, but more so the industry verticals, because change management is something that is necessary across the board for security compliance, and again, even for just maintaining sustainability of systems and so on. And then the last slide that I have here, and then we'll try and make sure we can get to some questions, is just a bit of awards. Netwrix Auditor is a massively award-winning product. Windows IT Pro, Redmond Mag. We've even just recently got reviewed by John and Petri as well. That's why when we asked John to be on here, he's very familiar with our product. Inc. 500, Inc. 5000, numbers of years in a row. So this is a product that's actually been award-winning not only by vendors that you know and trust, but even your fellow IT pros as well. And then I think we jump ahead, John. Just real quick, I have here the URLs to both the change notifier for Active Directory. Again, formerly the Active Directory Change Reporter Freeware Edition, if you're familiar with that, if you guys have known us for a couple of years, and there's a URL for that, as well as Netwrix Auditor for Active Directory in case you want to do a 20-day evaluation of that. I was working inside of a test drive. There's also a test drive available where you can kind of do what I did. You play inside of a web browser, and you're working with the product. That's also available there, and there's a URL for either of those if that interests you at all. And I think the last slide is yours, John.
Yes, it is. I just kind of wanted to wrap everything up, bring us full circle, and remind everyone of my kind of underlying theme that guides me when I talk about or think about AD auditing, which is you can't manage what you can't measure. And no, I didn't come up with that. I, gratuitously stole it from a much smarter mind than mine. But it does really apply here. And quit trying to dance around the problem. Just realize it's going to happen and accept it and move on, right? And part of that moving on is just to realize that solutions do exist to ease the pain. You don't have to buy anything. If you're not taking advantage of event log subscriptions today, do so. If you haven't tried out some of the AD freeware that's available from Netwrix and other places on the internet, do so. It can make the event log reporting a much easier process. And please check out both the free and the paid products from Netwrix. They're worth your time to investigate when it comes to AD auditing. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on this webinar. As Nick mentioned, I have gone through and done a full review, so you can read my thoughts on the subject on Petri if you'd like.
I'll send you the gift card after the webinar, John. Thanks.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, this is Jeff just hopping in. We've got a couple of attendee questions I just wanted to throw out. The first is, I've got a question from Tony, and he's asking if Netrix Auditor is the full-scale paid version of Change Notifier for AD, or are they separate, different, complementary products?
That's a great question. So no, Change Notifier is just a very light tool that does some looking in the event logs, does notification of those changes when they happen. It's using some same code base. It is not like a junior version of Auditor. Auditor is a full-blown product that does subscriptions where you can subscribe to certain reports and have them sent to you. You can get notifications and alerts. You can do full reporting, the snapshot recording. There's also the Active Directory Object Restore wizard that I talked about a little bit. This is not a junior version. It's just a tool that does something kind of similar. In case that's all you really need, we just wanted to give that to you guys to make sure that you have the ability to do something more than just event logs. And then you keep us in mind, so someday when you need something far more full-scaled, you have the ability to take a look at our full solutions. Great question. Thank you.
Okay, and I've got another question from another attendee that was asked earlier. Basically, it wasn't so much a question as it was a request, that maybe if you guys could talk a little bit about the need for auditing a PCI and HIPAA, and maybe if there's any special things they have to worry about. And that question
actually, yeah, that's a great question. I'll be happy to take the PCI side of things. Section 10 of PCI is all about logs. It's just logs, 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 and it almost drives me crazy because there's so much information about monitoring all the logs and make sure that your systems are secure. That's a great point in the fact that using a solution like either Netwrix Auditor or even just any of the stuff that we talked about that's free or even a competing solution. I'm aware that you have many choices and respect that. The very nature of trying to be able to identify when someone has improperly accessed credit card information in the case of PCI, patient records in the case of HIPAA, that's a real tough one. And having log data is going to be part of it. Active Directory becomes kind of a piece of that puzzle, but it's not the complete puzzle because Active Directory isn't going to tell you if someone accesses credit card data or patient records. You're obviously going to need other log data in there from other systems. And Active Directory is probably one of those things where you're going to be tracking back, why did they have access? To use John's example, that guy with the payroll records again, just as the analogy of whether it be credit card data or medical records for PCI or HIPAA, somebody gave that guy rights for 8 hours. And if you're going to be trying to track down how they got access, like we have this Target breach that happened back at Christmas time, people are going, how did it happen? We want to make sure it doesn't happen again. Well, was it a person that is working inside in cahoots with the guy that made the modification to the payroll file, or was it by accident, or was someone intended on doing something different and that person was just malicious on their own? And that's going to be part of your audit, is not just are you secure and are you compliant, and that's by you proving that no improper changes have been made, and that'll start with your medical records app for HIPAA. It'll start with wherever you're storing your credit card data, probably like an SQL server maybe, as an example. And then working all the way back up to Active Directory. John, anything to add? I'm sorry I commandeered that. I love compliance, and I've read both of those things from beginning to end, unfortunately, and I thought I'd at least pipe in.
No, I kind of complimentary, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, but, throwing out another one-liner, when it comes to HIPAA, it's kind of a proof is in the pudding kind of thing, right? That's what they want, is that you can prove compliance. It's not just the concept of compliance, it's being able to prove it. So when you look at something, you've got to show this is what I say this person has access to, and this is what the system says that person has access to, and they better jive, right? If they don't, that's when you have a big issue. And you know, it's not just Active Directory permissions or group policy permissions or those kind of things. It's the whole suite. Anything that possibly touches your medical data or the systems that hold your medical data, you better be auditing it. You better be logging it and recording it, because you could be called on it or asked to prove, hey, were you compliant on this day? Meaning, you know, you can tell me exactly who had access to what, how many times it was accessed that day, you know, for how long it was accessed, those kind of things. When it comes to HIPAA, they really do dive down into the details, and there's no ambiguity. They expect you to be able to prove all those things.
Thanks, John and Nick. I've actually got 2 more questions that just came in that are Netwrix product specific, so these are going your way, Nick. The first one is from Sunil.
Maybe I can earn a bonus card.
Yeah, it could be. The question from Sunil is, does this product have the ability to do Active Directory modeling as well?
Okay, good question. So by modeling, I'm assuming you're meaning something similar to like a resultant set of policies or something. And the answer is no. This is strictly focused on auditing the changes in Active Directory, taking the data sets, being the event logs and the snapshots, combining that together and formulating intelligent information that will help you make, you know, better decisions on whether you are compliant, whether you are secure, what changes were made, and so on. So no modeling whatsoever. No, this is just strictly auditing what changes and providing that information out.
Okay, great, thanks. And the next question is from Dinesh. She's asking, do you have any way for Active Directory compliance verification?
Wait, repeat that one more time. Do I have any?
The specific question is, do you have any way for Active Directory compliance verification? You know, is there any way to, I guess, match this against, you know, what your compliance demands are?
That's a tough one, and I'll tell you why it's a tough one. The reason is that, Dinesh, I'm glad you're asking this question. If you look at compliance standards, could be anything, could be HIPAA, SOX, PCI, COBIT, ITIL, you name it, and just about anything. They all have very ambiguous standards. I always like to say every one of them can be summed up at least at having something that says, establish and maintain levels of security. You know, but the reality is they have to be ambiguous because they can't be product specific or platform specific because they don't know what you're using. You might be using Linux and not Active Directory. You might be using, some kind of online-based email instead of Exchange. I don't know, whatever. So they have to make it kind of very generic. But it is true you have to establish and maintain levels of security. And so this is a very long-winded way of saying, you know, I don't have a way to say that your Active Directory is compliant for a couple reasons. One, depends on the compliance standard, but even within the context of a given compliance standard, if we were talking about one of them, everyone has a little bit of a different twist on it. When I used to consult for 20 years, I had lots of hospitals as clients, and I found that every single hospital was interpreting HIPAA differently. And they were like, we're HIPAA compliant. We know we are. And, okay. You know, it wasn't my focus. HIPAA was not my forte, but every time they were talking about it, they had a different way of thinking about how they were HIPAA compliant. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but the answer doesn't lie with Netrix Auditor. The answer kind of lies with sort of you, the customer, and the standard that you're trying to adhere to, and then how well-defined it is. And unfortunately, you have to add in how you interpret that well-defined standard. So that'll have to be my answer.
And I just want to throw in there that when they create these compliance standards, or even when organizations do, they're trying to keep in the back of their mind not only answering the questions that they come up with, but being able to answer questions they haven't come up with yet. So that's, I think one of the drivers behind why they are ambiguous and why they need to be, because they have to realize that there's questions they haven't thought of that they probably will need to answer.
Great, thanks, Nick and John. I've got another question here, and just to let everyone know, we're getting to the end of our Q&A section, so if any of you have any other questions, please send those in. But this next question here I've got is from Jones, and this is also directed towards you, Nick. He's asking if you can shed any light on configuration limitations for Netrix Auditor with regards to customized installations. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about how flexible Netrix Auditor is in terms of, working with a customized, IT environment.
Well, and with Auditor, with regard to Netwrix Auditor for Active Directory specifically, there's not a huge amount of customization because we're talking about basically trying to monitor your DCs, looking at the event data, again, taking a snapshot of Active Directory. Not trying to be redundant, just trying to make sure I'm level setting here. You might have a custom schema. That's fine because we're basically looking at whatever you happen to have in play. Think of Netwrix Auditor as more of an auditing platform, and it's going to work with whatever it is that you have with regard to whether it's Active Directory or Exchange or SQL Server or VMware or whatever the case is. We're kind of agnostic at that point because we're not being reliant on anything being installed. We're just simply utilizing the native environment that exists as it pertains to Active Directory. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please pipe in another quick comment or something if there's a different direction you'd like to go in, because I definitely would like to answer it.
Yeah, and anyone can hit us up on the Twitterverse, right? My handle is @JohnO'Neill Sr. Feel free to follow me and hit me up with questions. If I don't know the answer, I will go find the answer for you.
Okay, and thanks, John and Nick. It looks like we have 2 more questions that just came under the wire. These are our last 2 for this webinar. And these also look like they're directed towards you, Nick. The first one is from Santiago.
Man, I'm not feeling the love.
Hey, these might be hate questions. You don't know. I love when he says, "They're directed at you, Nick. These are your fault." Okay, I'm sorry. So what did Santiago ask?
Yes. His question is, can I configure email alerts for any changes made in Active Directory with Netrix?
You can configure most any changes with that. You do have the ability to set up some real-time alerts based on, in fact, if I'll just go off the list real quick. So you have changes to admin group membership. You have objects by administrator, any Active Directory object, and the idea is you can actually filter any Active Directory object down, so there is some customization there as well. Domain controller changes, demoting or promoting domain controllers, organizational unit deletion. These are just a couple of them. And you can also then go ahead and create your own new alert if you want. There's an ability there to basically specify filters, and the filters are rather detailed, where you can specify what kind of change, like who made the change maybe, or what kind of change it was. Was it a modification, an addition, a removal? What the object path is, which lets you pick down to a specific object. If it's an OU that you're picking, you can also pick child objects of that. You can also even go down to the attribute level. So the idea is it's very flexible. There's default ones that exist. I name them again, like admin group memberships, 80 objects by administrator, any object, DCs, demotions and promotions of DCs, and so on. Those are just some ones out of the box. But then you can go and create your own real-time alert filters, and it's all down to basically exactly what kind of change it was, what object it was. You can have, of course, wildcards. So Santiago, I hope that kind of answers your question, and you can set all that up within Netwrix Auditor for Active Directory. What was the last one?
Thanks, Nick. And I've got one final question. Yeah, sure. I've got one final question from Todd, and he's asking, what are the snapshot intervals and storage requirements?
Oh boy. So snapshot intervals are based on when changes are detected, and I believe it's once every 10 minutes is the minimum that we have. And then for storage requirements, the honest answer, Todd, is I don't know. Remember, I'm now in marketing, so I try and stay out of that. But let me do this, Todd. I've got your contact information because that's part of your logging into GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar, excuse me. I will get you an answer. If anyone else would like the same answers, just pipe in a question here because it'll show up afterwards on our report, and I'll be happy to make sure we get you an answer. Also, if there are any other questions that you're sort of thinking you want to ask, but you hear us kind of wrapping up, feel free right now just to really quickly write them in. It's okay, and we'll be happy to make sure that those questions get answered. And if, for whatever reason, you can't get in today, but you decide you had a question, go ahead and email sales@netrix.com. Just have them forward it to me. Just say, I want to forward this over to Nick. He works in marketing, and he did the webinar the other day. And my name is Nick Cavalancia, but you can just tell them whatever you can remember, and I'll make sure you get an answer to your question. So, Todd, I'll get you a definite answer about the storage requirements because I don't have it offhand of what requirements you'd have based on, I obviously don't know the size of your Active Directory either, but I'd rather get you a really good answer than kind of make one up off the cuff here that sounds sort of like I made one off the cuff.
Great answer. Well, great. I guess this concludes our webinar on Active Directory auditing headaches and how to solve them. So I'd like to thank, first of all, I'd like to thank Nick and John for taking the time out of their busy schedules to actually hold the webinar this morning, or this afternoon.
Glad to do it this evening, tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Glad to be here, Jeff. Thank you for having us.
Exactly. Pick your time zone. And I'd also, and more importantly, like to thank everyone that took the time out of their busy schedules to attend this webinar. And like Nick said, if you have any questions or any other feedback about this webinar, definitely let us know. And with that, we will sign off and wish all of you, I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.